Our module this week deals with Ethiopia and the possibility of agricultural land development in Ethiopia. And Ethiopia is our test case for areas of growth in farmland in the future. And I titled this module, The Next Brazil, or is the question, can Ethiopia or some other area or country in Africa be our next Brazil? As we all know, and I've talked about in this class, Brazil has increased its production of all agricultural products, and soybeans in particular. Here you're looking at hectares grown in soybeans in Brazil. Those increases have occurred because of increased demand for soybeans and other agricultural products around the world, largely due not to population increases, but increases in real income and that change in diet and moving from a diet primarily consumed of cereals to that which includes proteins and animals. So, as we continue to see growth, we will likely to see growth in income. We will likely to see continued demand for agricultural products. Before talking about the case of Ethiopia in specific, I want to talk a little bit about the motives for developing agricultural land. There are two primary reasons why an individual would want to develop agricultural land. First is that the cash rent or the cost of the land would be extremely low. The second is that there's a possibility of large capital gains as that land increases in value. For example, in Brazil, in a developed area, land would have a price that has increased over time, primarily because that area has become more developed. I'm showing here a budget for central Illinois corn and soybean production, and you can see their gross revenue, non-land cost, operator and land return, and that is the amount that can be split between the farmer and the landowner. You also see their cash rent, and cash rent in central Illinois is roughly $270 per acre, and land price in central Illinois would be about $10,000 per acre currently. That land price exists because agriculture is very well developed in central Illinois, and returns to farmland tend to accrue to the farmland itself. That is not so in an undeveloped area. In an undeveloped area, the land price may be extremely low, and you saw that when you read the article on Ethiopia, the Financial Times article, that the land price was extremely low. So if you're looking at this budget, you would take away that $270 of cash rent, replace it with two, probably add some other cost to that, and that would be your budget. But the instance here, why first you would want to develop land, is the land costs are extremely low, and if you own the land, there's a possibility of that land increasing in value and you get capital gains. The development of land in an undeveloped area tends to be a boom or bust business. If you're one of the early developers of farmland and it's successful, you tend to become very wealthy. On the other hand, if it doesn't work out, you tend to lose all your investment. So this is a boom to bust business of developing land, and it has obviously high rewards and high risk. Now let's turn to Ethiopia and just give some background about Ethiopia. You see the country in blue there, that is where Ethiopia is. It has 426,000 square miles. Just to put that in perspective, we in Illinois have 58,000 square miles. So Ethiopia is approximately 4 to 4.5 times the size of Illinois. In 2015, it had 96 million people, compared to 12.6 in Illinois, 318 in the United States. So it's much more, it has twice the density as Illinois does in terms of population density. Its GDP is very low, $1,500 an acre compared to something over $50,000 for the U.S., but it does have some very good farmland. That farmland happens to be located away from the coast, so it's not near or easily exported. Here you see the scores that we showed in class last time: voice and accountability, political stability, government effectiveness, regulatory quality, rule of law, control of corruption. In general, Ethiopia would rate fairly low on all of those scales, at least compared to the other countries that we're looking at. It's not as low as some, but it is low relative to other countries that exist. Ethiopia has had a history of war and famine, and I use the word in the past. Hopefully that's over. Many of the battles between the West and the former Soviet Union took place or there was a lot of contentiousness in Africa as West and Soviet Union tried to control parts of Africa. Ethiopia was a part of that. Ethiopia is officially a democracy. However, as you see here from a quote, it's an authoritative regime. It's dropped 12 places, and there have been crackdowns of opposition activity in the past. So while it's officially a democracy, it really is a one-party democracy, and it doesn't tolerate well opposition in certain cases. Agriculture is important to the Ethiopian economy. It represents 46% of GDP. To give you a feel, in the United States it would be below 10%. It's 83.9% of its exports and 80% of its labor force, and most of that labor force is small subsistence farms. Ethiopia's major cash crops are coffee. Ethiopian coffee, if you're a coffee drinker, usually is a good descriptor. Many people want Ethiopian coffee. Other major cash crops are pulses and oilseeds, flour, cat, which I don't know what it is, and cotton. There has been a history of land reform in Ethiopia, and let me just cover those areas for you. You see the source listed there at the bottom. Before 1974, there was a complex system of land ownership, and it was described as feudal, which isn't a compliment. Feudal generally would mean that land ownership and serfdom ownership of individuals go together. In the mid-1960s, there was a major land reform. Government nationalized rural land. It did so without compensation. It abolished tenancy, so you couldn't farm land that wasn't your own, and forbade hiring of wage labor. That again resulted in or led to or had an impact on famines, and in 1984 socialist principles were used. Those socialist principles usually revolved around collectivization and large agricultural enterprises. I want to highlight two quotes that happened as a result of this socialism collectivization. The first one that you see listed at top, and again, much of the emphasis of this state farms building large enterprises was to increase output so that we could export and get some foreign exchange. First quote, state farms received a large share of the country's resources, 43%. However, it produced 6% of total agricultural output. The remainder largely came from peasant farmers that were farming their own small plots. This is a well-worn critique of state farms and socialism. At the bottom there, at the same time we were doing state farms, we were collecting native Ethiopians and grouping them together in villages. And here, the object of villagization included grouping scattered farm communities. So we were taking farm communities that existed throughout the land and bringing them into clusters. So we were forcing people to move to a specific area, which, as you would imagine, people would object to, particularly if they've been in that area a long time. The motive for that was, one, to make room for these state enterprises, but also, there is also, if we group people together, it's easier to form services. In any case, that was some of the things that happened during the collectivization period, and you will see, as you read the Financial Times article, elements of that still existing today. So, the democratic government, or the government today, still believes that if we can get large agricultural enterprises, exports, we can improve our situation. Now, rather than collectivization, the emphasis has turned to creating private, profit-making enterprises, privately owned. The FT article, which you are to read, is actually at least round 2 of that effort. Round 1 began with bringing Indian farmers into Ethiopia. And there was a large firm, Karyutori, which I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, but it's a large firm that essentially specializes in flowers, that leased a lot of land in Africa, and they released or owned 300,000 acres in Ethiopia, and that was the first large enterprise, private enterprise that I'm aware of, that moved into Ethiopia. Here's a quote, 2 quotes. You see the article if you want to look at that. This comes from article that you see listed below. Indians moved into Africa and then realized some of the difficulties. First paragraph: needed water. There were few irrigation possibilities. Diesel wasn't around, and below that, markets didn't exist. So after we produced the product, getting it to market proved to be a problem. And you can think about this a little bit. Getting the inputs there was a problem. Getting the outputs there was a problem. As a result of that, these first round firms largely failed, and now we're sort of moving on to round 2. The Great Land Rush, and this is a Financial Times article, and I would suggest I provided a PDF for it, but the interactive features on the link are actually very good. Financial Times has done a number of articles on what they call the Great Land Rush. This one deals with Ethiopia. You can see some of the other areas where they have focused on as well. This article focuses on one company, Saudi Star Agricultural Developments. Saudi Star began in 2009 and has struggled. It has a lease on 10,000 hectares and has bought 8,000 more, so it's placed some bet on this being a successful project. If it becomes successful, or if this area develops, it will get capital gains on 8,000 hectares of land. To put that 10,000 hectares in perspective for Illinois and U.S. farmers or U.S. individuals, that's 24,710 acres. Part of the issue that they've had is moving produce to market, and after they've produced it, you see the quote there, and this comes from the FT article, they've had problems getting it to market. So after they produced it, there's no market. Here is a quote from the article, and this again deals with overall agriculture in Ethiopia. It's reminiscent of the socialistic enterprises. 80% is consumed by households that produce it. This would be subsistent farmers. These farmers rely on their hands. A mere 5% of agricultural output comes from big commercial farms, but they are the link in the government strategy to complete its journey from famine to more production. So, Ethiopian government still has a plank in its strategy to promote large-scale agricultural enterprises. As you can imagine, this is controversial, and the question is, should we promote, rent land, sell land to large operations? Pros: quick way to do agricultural development, and you can get agricultural expertise. As you will see here, most of these individuals do know something about agriculture. Again, number 2 there on the pros, it's a quick way to develop land, and hopefully local individuals would also benefit from this enterprise through wages. The cons is that foreign, not natives, control the farmland, and you'll see this is the case here. Saudi Star is not a Ethiopian enterprise, or it's owned by individuals outside Ethiopia. We still have this sphere of villagization, or moving people from land areas to other areas to make this area work. I'd also point out that this looks a lot like colonialization, colonial efforts during the early 1900s and late 1800s, and those were less than successful for African individuals. Here are 3 review questions for this module. The first one will be our quiz on Monday. What would you do if you were Saudi Star, you're part of the management, or you're a consultant? What would you do to improve the probability of the success of Saudi Star? I want you to provide two pieces of advice on the quiz, which will be on Monday. So think about it, come up with 2 pieces of advice. I'm looking for a sentence and a little bit of justification for each one. I mean, this will be a 5 to 10 minute quiz, so that is your quiz. Number 2, what would you do? Provide advice. What advice would you provide to the Ethiopian government? Would you suggest that they continue to lease land to foreign individuals? Finally, and by the way, that's not on the quiz, but we will talk about that during class. And finally, would you advise ADM to make investments to transport agricultural products out of Gambia? So, would you advise ADM to become part of this process? Again, our quiz will be the first one, and I'm going to look for bullet points 1 and 2 on that.